Hey everyone, how are we doing today? This is James Sweeney, aka Split Suit, and welcome back to another video. And in this video, I'm going to talk all about crushing fish pre-flop. And it's important that we know how to beat up fish, simply because fish are bad players, and a lot of our win rate actually comes from fish. And while as we get higher and higher into the mid-stakes games and high-stakes games, there are less and less fish, there are plenty of fish to abuse in the micro and small stakes games. And it's just important that we can abuse them as much as possible, get involved with them, and take as much money from them before other people do. And in this video, I'll talk about everything from the types of fish there are and general ways to abuse them. And we're also going to talk about when to cold call them, how to, 3-betting, 4-betting, and all sorts of other fun stuff. So without further ado, let's just jump right into it, start having some fun, and talk about crushing fish. So let's first start by talking about the kinds of fish that there are. I like to separate fish into two very broad categories, passive fish and aggressive fish, also known as P-fish and A-fish. And the reason why I do that is because most fish tend to be very easy to find based upon their stats and fall into one of those categories. And oftentimes we don't have a huge sample size on fish either. So it makes it difficult to have an exact idea on how they're going to c-bet or react versus c-bets. It's kind of one of those, just have to take a broad idea most of the time, kind of a stereotyped idea, mostly because we usually don't have multiple hundreds of hands on these players. Usually we're lucky to have 50 to 60 hands simply because fish buy in, they bust out, and then they go away and go back to doing whatever it is the fish do in their real lives. So the way that I like to find these people statistically is P-fish tend to have a huge gap in their VPIP PFR, and aggressive fish tend to have smaller gaps in their VPIP PFR, and usually aggro fish tend to have PFRs that are very high, usually higher than 25%. And just finding fish in general is very easy because they have VPIPs that aren't really sustainably profitable. So usually they're playing more than 30% of their hands, and usually they're playing them awfully. Passive fish are going to be doing more open limping, more cold calling, so that's why they have that bigger gap in the VPIP PFR, and that pre-flop passivity tends to carry over post-flop. And aggressive fish, again, tend to have high VPIPs, also high PFRs, and they just tend to 3-bet too much, they tend to 4-bet too much, they tend to open raise from everywhere. And, I mean, in general, passive fish are going to be more calling stations, so we're going to be doing a ton of value betting against them. Although we do value bet a ton against fish in general, aggressive fish are usually more likely to make betting and bluffing mistakes themselves, so sometimes we give them enough rope to hang themselves. So hopefully this gives you an idea on how to find them easier. Again, as a general default, we don't have enough stats on them to usually make big, huge inferences, but by the same token, we can make stereotyped thought processes, and usually that's going to be a good starting point against fish. So let's look at a few examples. Let's take this first one where there's a fish that raises from middle position, and we're deciding what we want to do with King 10. I see a lot of people that want to get involved with fish pre-flop and will oftentimes sacrifice position or sacrifice card strength simply to get involved with fish. And yes, we want to get involved with fish, most certainly, but usually we want to do so with either card strength in our favor, position strength in our favor, or combination thereof. And oftentimes the reason why we do that is because why do we want to put ourselves in spots, let's say if we were to flat call in this exact spot, why would we want to put ourselves out of position with a hand that has a lot of domination in it? And if MP is a passive fish, he's most likely going to crush us a very large chunk of the time, simply because he's raising a stronger range of hands. And while he's still a fish, the fact that he raises very little pre-flop implies that he's going to have a stronger hand, and King 10 is going to perform very poorly against it. Even against an aggressive fish who is raising more hands, and maybe we dominate a couple of them, there's still reverse implied odds the times we catch a king high board or a 10 high board or say like a queen 10 board. And also, are we really going to make that much money? We're out of position, we miss the flop 2/3 of the time, third of the time we do catch, we're sometimes playing that wishy-washy game where we're not really sure and we're out of position, and if he's an aggressive fish he's probably going to fire multiple streets, which puts us under a lot of pressure. So it becomes a situation where, yes, we want to get involved with fish, but we don't want to get involved with fish poorly. So we want to be very, very careful about our pre-flop hand selection. And that means when we're cold calling, that also means when we're 3-betting, when we're 4-betting, when we're open raising as well. We want to keep all those in mind. So in this exact situation, as a pure default, I'm going to suggest folding, and I think more people would perform better if they just folded the garbage side of their stuff, ace 10, ace 9, king 10, queen jack in a lot of situations, particularly out of position against fish. Yes, we want to get involved with them. No, we don't want to do so usually out of position with crappy cards, simply because they're not going to perform well, we're not going to make money, and why do we want to be a fish towards a fish? Okay, in this next spot we have fives, folds around, button decides to open, and here's deciding what he wants to do. And a lot of people tend to get confused in this situation and also make pretty large mistakes, and this would be the kind of spot where I'd always ask Hero how he's going to make money. And most players, for whatever reason, call here, particularly against fish, and they cite implied odds as their main reason. And my main question to you is, how are you really going to get paid here? You're going to miss the flop a tremendous amount of the time, roughly 88%. The little bit of the time you do catch, how are you going to make money in that spot? If your opponent's stealing, say even just a 20% range, he's going to not hit the board very hard the times that you hit, and thus it makes it very difficult to actually get the implied odds that you were originally citing for your cold call in the first place. So this is a situation where I don't really want to do a tremendous amount of cold calling. And some people will say, well, I have a slight amount of showdown value and I'm going to play poker post-flop. How are you going to do that? You're out of position. Your showdown value is usually going to be third or fourth pair. And are you really comfortable facing multiple streets of pressure? I mean, you could be paying off very, very easily against a fish, particularly against a passive fish. And you just don't have anywhere near enough info, nor ideas, nor stack depth, nor implied odds, nor really anything to justify calling this. So this is a spot where I would either 3-bet or fold. And as a default, I don't suggest we do a lot of light 3-betting against fish, particularly out of position. And in the next example, we'll talk about exactly why. So if we take a spot like this and the cutoff opens and here's deciding what he wants to do and say he 3-bets. So let's talk about why I don't like to light 3-bet fish. Well, there's one big thing that we like when we are light 3-betting, and that's folds. Whether it's folds now, aka that he folds a lot to our 3-bet, or that he folds a little bit pre-flop but folds a lot post-flop, say he plays really straightforward on boards and we can c-bet, or we have some double barrel ideas or whatever it is. Ultimately, when we're light 3-betting or light 4-betting or really doing anything in a bluffy sense, it's usually because we think there's enough folds to make it profitable. Now, the big thing that separates us from fish is discipline, and mostly the discipline to fold. This is why fish are very easy to spot on the HUD just looking at VPIP and PFR. They play too many hands, and tags, nits, good lags don't. It's that simple. It's just the fact that fish can't find the fold button. They feel they need to get involved all the time, and because of that, their stats become very, very obvious that they're fishy. Just like, it's very easy to spot a fish over a small sample, because, say, over 2 orbits, a fish could easily be running with a 60% VPIP. A good tag or a good nit, even over 2 orbits, is rarely ever going to play with a VPIP that large, particularly if there's a gap in the VPIP PFR, even over such a small sample. So again, it's the fact that fish don't fold, and fish don't fold a lot now, and fish don't fold a lot later either. Fish are very notorious for taking things way too far post-flop, whether that's ace high, whether that's third or fourth pair. We don't know. All we know is that they don't fold a tremendous amount, and it's a situation where we're probably not going to be winning a decent amount of the time unless we hit. And when we hit in this situation, we're catching on King XX, maybe there's a little bit of value to be had there, but there's also reverse implied odds, the times that he has ace king, king queen, king jack, whatever it be. So this is the kind of spot where I would not be bluffing a fish. I just don't think fish are going to fold enough now nor later, and that's why as a general default I want to be very tight and straightforward and value injected when I 3-bet against a fish. Things like queens plus, things like ace king, things like sometimes ace queen, jacks, and tens if the situation is correct for it and the positions are correct for it. But too many people try to take these light 3-bets or like super thin 3-bets against fish, and in general it's not going to be all that good, because take a situation where you 3-bet him regardless of what kind of fish he is. What are you going to do when you miss? And you're going to miss a lot of the time, and are you planning on throwing out c-bets because he's not going to fold very often? So this entire spot can be totally avoided just by playing a little bit better pre-flop. But again, it takes that discipline to find the fold button. The same discipline that you need him to have in order to make the 3-bet is the same reason why you actually need to be folding yourself. So again, just as a pure default, stay very value oriented against fish. Don't try to bluff them because they're not going to fold. That's how we make money, because we wait for decent hands, then we smash them when they make those big call mistakes, and then we make a lot of value. We don't usually make a lot of money by trying to bring crap hands to war against them, particularly in 3 and 4-bet pots. So speaking of value hands, take a spot like this where fish opens and we're deciding what we want to do. So regardless of whether MP2 is an aggro fish or a passive fish, I'm still going to be 3-betting this. And I actually don't even mind 3-betting a little bit larger, 3-betting something closer to 4x in situations like this, simply because fish are fish. And especially against the fish that can't fold pre-flop, the ones that just feel they need to see every single flop, there's nothing wrong with making a little bit bigger pre-flop, simply because you generate a little bit of extra value, and it doesn't really matter, because if they call, it's still going to be a pretty smallish SPR pot, roughly 4 and change, and a 4 SPR pot with an overpair, as a default against a fish, I'm going to be stacking off. 3 or less, pretty much auto. And again, that's with a top pair plus or an overpair. And this is why against fish, especially when you're creating smaller SPR pots, aka in 3-bet pots, 4-bet pots, etc., that we want to be strong side weighted, because we create smaller SPRs, ones where we're going to be more forced to correctly take top pair and overpairs very far. So I want to put myself in situations where I have hands that can actually do that comfortably. King 8 is not one of them. Kings and aces obviously are. So in a situation like this, regardless of who MP2 is, chances are I'm going to be betting. There are situations where if MP2 were an aggro fish, I might be more apt to check to him, because an aggro fish is more likely to make that bluff mistake, as opposed to a passive fish where I'm more likely just to bet it myself, simply because passive fish again tends to be pretty synonymous with calling station, and it's criminal to miss a value bet against a calling station. We just need to be value betting against them. And we're going to do another video later all about crushing fish post-flop, and we'll talk about these kind of hands in a bit more detail. But it's also important that we know how to handle them when we're talking about pre-flop and how we want to handle them there. Again, it's a 3-bet, create a smaller SPR pot. As a default, definitely going to be stacking. And if we decide to bet and he raises, like I said, I'm not folding, I'm stacking off here, so I'll most likely be shoving myself and expecting to stack off with an edge. I acknowledge that sometimes he is going to have pocket 7s, pocket 6s, 7-6, jack 6 suited, whatever it be, but I'm not worried about it. Overall, his stack range is going to be awful. And this is also another thing. Fish are likely to raise here with hands that good players wouldn't. Like, a good player isn't really going to raise here at jack 10. They'd rather treat it as showdown value. They understand that the raise doesn't really accomplish much except in select situations. So it would be a spot where a good player would normally call. A bad player, like a fish, is more likely to not understand showdown value. So he's more likely to raise hands that we would call because he doesn't have a rationale for doing things. He doesn't think about what his bets or raises accomplish. He just says, LOL, I have top pair, and thus I stack off. So this is why we kind of open up our stack off range against fish, but we also want to be prepared to have stronger hands against them so that we can really generate a huge edge and obviously just print value in these kind of situations. So next I want to talk a little bit about reacting to 3-bets against fish, because that can always be a little bit awkward and creates kind of a confusing situation. So we'll take a spot where we open ace queen and face a 3-bet from a fish, and we're deciding what we want to do. So as we talked about earlier, there are two main kinds of fish, aggro fish and passive fish. So passive fish, when they 3-bet, tend to be very, very strong, and thus we need a much stronger hand to play. We either need, some sort of aces or kings, and we can consider going for the 4-bet at that point, but most of the time giving them light action is not going to be an excellent idea. So if the big blind here were, say, a 42-6 over 100 hands, had a very small 3-bet, say 1-ish%, this would be a situation where I'd probably fold, because that passive fish is not worried about re-stealing. That passive fish doesn't understand the concept. They're just simply 3-betting because they think they have a strong hand. Their strong hand range crushes us, even if it's, say, like a jacks plus ace king, and very easy situation to fold out. Very simple. And it doesn't matter if we open from the cutoff, if we open from early position, if you 3-bet on the button, if we 3-bet from the blinds. It doesn't matter. If he's 3-betting that strongly, you can't give action with hands like this. It's that simple. Now, if the big blind were an aggro fish, has that really high 3-bet percentage, particularly in the re-steal game, then I'm more likely to give action, and I'm not going to be folding my ace-queen. And exactly what I do is dependent on a couple things. A lot of people will just 4-bet it because they say it's easier, they want to stack it off, and my whole question is, why do you want to stack it off? Simply because I think too many people take ace-queen to the felt too liberally, particularly at 6 max, and in my opinion that's not going to be a good idea. So I would always ask, first of all, why the heck are you doing that? So in a situation like this, if I think that he's 3-betting that aggressively, by flatting here, I keep him involved with all of it. Say he's 3-betting 15% of hands, which is really aggressive in this spot. Well, I obviously crush a 15% of range hands, regardless of how he shapes it. If he 3-bets completely depolarized and all in the top left quadrant, I'm still doing fine against it. If he 3-bets crappier stuff, so suited connectors, small pairs, total garbage, suited whatever, obviously I do much better against that. So either way, I'm very comfortable. Plus, of course, I have position, I have skill edge, I think I have card edge because he's 3-betting so aggressively, so I have all these edges in my favor, and thus I'm more likely to consider flatting and playing poker. And it's important to know, again, how you're going to react versus a P fish versus an A fish, and it's the same thing. Like, you're not going to treat a nit and a lag the exact same way. I mean, those are totally different players. They 3-bet differently, they think about things differently, and thus we're going to change our ranges based upon which one they are, which situation we're facing. In this exact spot, say we think he's an A fish and the flatting is profitable. Let's just take a situation where we miss. A lot of people, they flat it pre, but then have no idea what to do when they miss post-flop, which is, of course, going to happen about 2/3 of the time. They face a bet. A lot of the times I suggest playing relatively straightforward in these situations, particularly for a couple reasons. One, he's a fish. We don't need to worry about balancing. He's not taking advantage of anyone. He's a fish. So don't think that you need to peel this sometimes, or you need to go for a bluff raise sometimes, because that's not the case. He's a fish. He's not thinking like that. He's not thinking. That's what makes him a fish. So it's important that you recognize that. Don't just go doing things just for the sake of, dare I say, balancing, because that's a great way to burn money. So that's first and foremost. Secondly is by playing straightforward, you generate so much extra value the times that the board comes ace high or queen high that usually I'm not very worried about it. Yes, I'm still missing the flop 2/3 of the time, and yes, I'm probably going to be folding to this bet a huge chunk, but by the same token, I make so much more the times that I catch versus the $7 extra that I lose when I miss, that I'm not worried about it, particularly against the width of his range, the fact that he's an aggro fish and he's going to see bet a lot, the fact that he's a fish and he's going to take things too far post-flop and make bluffing mistakes and make calling mistakes. I'm not worried about playing a bit more straightforward in this spot. So again, it's a very easy spot when we hit, it's a very easy spot when we miss, and preflop, again, big inflection point. What kind of fish is he? Is he 3-betting super strong? Is he 3-betting super wide? How do I want to react with a hand like ace-queen? And it's on you to think about how you want to react there with ace-jack, or ace-10, or king-queen, or king-jack. All those hands play relatively similarly. Same thing with those strong mid-ish pairs, 7s, 8s, 9s, 10s. Again, do some thinking on your own. Think about how he's 3-betting. Think about how you're going to make money. Think about how flops are logically going to go down. And think about if it's going to be a profitable situation or a losing situation. Okay, so in this next hand we have aces, and we open, face a 3-bet. So, like I said, there's kind of like 3 different hands you have when you face a 3-bet from a fish. You have total garbage, you have that middle of the road stuff like ace, queen, and pocket nines, and then you have the super nutted stuff like kings plus, sometimes queen plus, that sort of stuff. As a default, I am going to be 4-betting against most players that are fish, simply because if he's a passive fish, it means his 3-bet range should be very strong, and thus he's more likely to continue because he 3-bet strong. Fish don't have a fold button. He's probably going to continue with all of it. Thus, I'm just 4-betting totally for value. If he's an A fish and maybe he's 3-betting a little bit wider, it gives him a chance to go for that bluff 5-bet shove. and also he'll still sometimes make some calling mistakes, so I'm happy about all that as well. If he's super aggro, just you need to give him the rope to hang himself, there's nothing wrong with calling and letting him barrel off all 3 streets, but that's something that I would do more in position, simply because I don't risk the I check, he checks behind, and then I lose a street of value type thing. When in doubt, 4-bet for value against fish, and just kind of go from there, and I'm totally okay with that. And for the record, say you get flatted and you have to figure out what kind of line you're going to take. Well, on a board like this, as a default, probably going to be c-betting. And just c-bet as much as you can get called. And particularly against fish, I usually like to bet as much as I can get called by like an ace-king or king-queen type hand. Simply because I doubt he's going to fold any pair. I think he'll shove some pairs as well. And I also just like to give him a lot of room to make mistakes. And given the SPR, roughly 1.5, I'm never going to be folding post-flop anyway. So it's not a concern. It's just how can I take the most profitable line. If the button were an A-fish, you could certainly consider checking here to induce the spaz shove from him. Really depends on who he is, what kind of mistakes you think he's going to make. When in doubt, I'd always bet myself. Again, I have a value hand against a fish. Default is to go for value and bet. If I had a weaker hand, obviously I'm going to change my opinion. But in this situation, when he shoves, obviously we're snapping and hoping to hold up and win a nice big pot against a big stupid fish. And one last thing I wanted to talk about real quick, and just talking a little bit about preflop dynamics and how you can change your opening ranges a pinch based upon where fish are and what fish are doing. So for instance, if you are in a situation where you're in early position, you have like a mildly strong hand, and you have a fish behind you who's an aggro fish doing a ton of 3-betting. I'm going to change my opening range from there. First, I'm going to see if I can change seats and get on his left. But also, if I'm stuck in a spot where I have to play with him on my left and he's an aggro fish, I'm probably going to open a bit tighter, simply because he's going to 3-bet me more, and I don't want to just keep raise folding against him, simply because I'm just going to be burning too much money. So we do want to be dynamic. We do want to adjust to the fish and where the fish are and how they tend to make their mistakes, blah, blah, blah. The other thing is fish in the blinds. So when there are fish in the blinds, I'm going to change my opening range a little bit, particularly from like early and middle position. So I might open a little bit wider from, say, early position. So at 6 max, King Jack suited is not in my standard opening range from under the gun. But if this were a spot where, say, the big blind were a big fish and I thought that I could get heads up with him, then I would consider raising this more. And again, you notice 2 things. One, I said the fish was in the blinds, so I'm going to have position on him if I go post-flop. 2, I have a hand that's going to be strong enough to utilize, so I'm not sitting here opening with, say, 4 or 5 suited. And then the third piece of it is that I think I can get heads up with that fish. If I think that there's other fish in between and that we're going to go like 3 or 4 away to it, it's not really something I want to do, particularly as monkey in the middle. So I'm very much considering everything. Where the fish is, what kind of hand strength I have, my likelihood of getting heads up with that fish. You know, sometimes we're going to open here in a great situation and then it's going to 3-bet us. It happens. I'm not going to super worry about that, but it's still something that we want to consider. So in this situation, you know, if the big blind were a fish, I can be totally on board with it. And then when you go post-flop, it's really just a pure value bet game and just simply going from there. So in this spot, bet the flop, bet the turn, and then on the river, probably going for a value bet as well, just thinking that he'll make enough call mistakes with worse Jack X, worse 10X. If he check raises at any given point, particularly if he's a passive fish, probably going to hate life and fold, but in this situation, generates some nice value against a second best hand. So again, you notice how using your brain pre-flop, you were able to find an extra situation, one that normally would have been a fold, but turns out to be in a nice profitable spot against a fishy opponent because we thought about that from pre-flop before we even opened our hand. So that's going to wrap it up for this video. Again, we talked all about crushing fish pre-flop, talked about what kind of fish there are, how to easily identify them, talked about cold calling against them, talked about 3-betting against them and why we want to veer away against bluffing, talked about 4-betting and responding to their 3-bets, then also talked a little bit about targeting fish and how to be dynamic pre-flop, how to adjust our ranges both by tightening them and by opening them up a little bit when the situation is correct for it. So again, hopefully this gives you a nice primer on how to start improving your win rate against fish. A lot of it does boil down to the pre-flop play. Choosing the correct ranges of hands, not putting yourself in junky situations, and in general, being a little bit tighter against fish, being a little bit more value injected is never going to be that bad of a plan. Particularly if you have any leakage in your post-flop game, that would be my general suggestion. So same as always, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to let me know. Otherwise, good luck out there, happy grinding, and good luck crushing fish.